Hello and welcome to today's webinar on why design validation is more than testing. How do we validate our validation? My name is John Spear. I'm the founder and VP of Quality and Regulatory here at Greenlight Guru, and I will be the moderator for today's event. We've got a really special presentation for you today. I know our presenter, Mike Drews, is really looking forward to sharing his insights and expertise on medical device design validation and go-to-market strategies. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our presenter and his consultancy, Vascular Sciences, I'm going to touch on a few items real quick. First, today's webinar is going to run for probably about 90 minutes in total, and we'll include a Q&A session at the end where Mike has been kind enough to answer all of your questions. So I encourage you to submit your questions throughout the webinar as they come up in the box on the right-hand side, and we will get to as many of them as time permits. I'd also like to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on these free training sessions. If you've ever been on one of our training sessions before, then you know we put on these because improving the quality of life is our mission at Greenlight Gurus, likely a mission that's similar to many of you on today's webinar. Anything that we can do as an organization that helps device makers bring safer, life-changing devices to market quicker with less risk aligns with that mission. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether it's through hosting these free training sessions and webinars, through partnering with world-class medical device consultants like today's presenter, Mike Drews, or through our award-winning medical device EQMS software platform designed specifically and exclusively for the medical device industry by actual medical device professionals. If you'd like to learn more about why medical device companies from across the globe are moving away from paper-based general purpose quality management tools and adopting the Greenlight Guru purpose-built medical device quality management software, I would encourage you to go over to www.greenlight.guru after today's presentation to schedule your free personalized one-on-one demo. In doing so, you will learn how the very best medical device companies are leveraging the purpose-built QMS to gain ISO 13485 certification, market clearances and approvals, breeze through audits, and push beyond just compliance to produce true quality medical devices. So like I said, if you're interested in learning how we can help your device company, make sure you visit www.greenlight.guru after today's webinar and schedule your free one-on-one personalized demo. Now let's get on to today's presentation, and let me give a proper introduction to my good friend and today's presenter, Mike Drews. Mike is president of Vascular Sciences, a consulting and training company offering a broad range of services to medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotechnology companies, including creative regulatory strategy and competitive regulatory intelligence, regulatory submission design, FDA presentation, preparation, and defense. Also worth noting that Mike works on a regular basis with regulatory agencies, including US FDA, Health Canada, as well as US and European patent offices, centers for Medicare and Medicaid services, and other regulatory and governmental agencies around the world. Dr. Drews, that's right, he is a doctor, PhD, smart guy, folks, is internationally recognized expert and featured keynote speaker on the cutting edge medical technologies and regulatory affairs. He conducts seminars and short courses for medical device, pharmaceutical, biotechnology companies, FDA, Health Canada, patent offices, Medicaid, Medicare, and other government agencies around the world. Finally, Mike is an adjunct professor of medicine, biomedical engineering, and biotechnology, and it teaches graduate courses in regulatory affairs and clinical trials, clinical trial design at several universities and medical schools around the world. So without further ado, let me hand it over to today's presenter, Mike Drews.
Well, thank you, John, for that very kind introduction. I want to thank you and Greenlight for the opportunity to conduct this webinar today, and a special thanks to everyone in the audience, because obviously without you, there would be no point of doing this. This particular webinar, as John just mentioned, is titled Why Design Validation is More Than Just Testing. How do we validate our validation? Or my alternative tagline is Not Your Grandmother's Approach to Validation. Because as we'll get into here, I think, quite frankly, most of what I hear people talking about when it comes to validation and verification and so on is so general, so boring, and quite frankly, not very instructive. And so I wanted to take this opportunity to dig into some of these topics a little bit further. Before we do that, I just wanted to echo two things about my bio that John mentioned, and my bio will be in the handout available for this webinar, which should be sent to you after the webinar is over. First of all, as John mentioned, I do work as a consultant for the FDA as well as several other regulatory agencies. And the reason why I point that out is because there's not a lot of people that can say that work on both sides of that proverbial fence. And so I try to really use that to my advantage. The second thing I wanted to just mention is, in addition to consulting for a wide variety of companies as well as the FDA, I also am a contributing editor to several medical technology and regulatory publications, including the Greenlight podcast series. But here is a list of a number of them. I'm constantly putting out a lot of columns and articles and podcasts and webinars on a variety of different topics. I would encourage you to check these out when you have time, because there's a lot of good information in there. Okay. Without further ado, let's start getting into the content of this particular webinar. And I just want to start out with a few polling questions for the audience just to kind of see where we are. And these are all yes or no questions. There are 4 of them. Do you validate your validation now? Do you justify not just what you do, but also what you don't do? Do you take your validation strategy to the FDA prophylactically, that is, before there's a problem, maybe in the form of a pre-submission meeting or a pre-sub or something else? And finally, and this is probably my favorite question on the list, do you agree that even if a validation is required, if it's not realistic, it's a waste of time and money? So, John, why don't we just push those out to the audience, and we'll give them just a few seconds to respond, and you can share the results.
Absolutely. So we'll do these one by one, folks, in order to give you an opportunity to chime in. So the first poll, do you validate your validation? Pretty easy. Click yes or no. So we'll take a few moments.
How are our results looking on that one, John?
All right, we'll go ahead and close that with about 2/3 of the folks chiming in. Look like roughly about 2/3 of folks say no.
Interesting. Okay, let's go on to the next question.
Next question, do you justify not just what you do, but what you don't do? So we'll give that a few moments here. And we'll go ahead and close that. About 70% are saying yes to that one.
That's interesting. That's a little bit of a surprise to me, but that's good to know. Okay.
All right.
Let's go on to the third one.
Third one, do you take your validation strategy to FDA prophylactically? So we'll give everyone a chance to chime in on this. Seeing a theme here, Mike. And we'll close that one. 2/3 are saying no on that.
Interesting.
And then the last question, do you agree that even if a validation is required, if it's not realistic, it's a waste of time and money?
You know me, John. You can appreciate why that's my favorite question on the list.
Yeah, this one's the most polarizing. We're going to go ahead and close that at about 50-50 on that one, Mike.
Okay, 50-50 on that last one. Well, thank you, everybody, for participating. That helps me sort of gauge as an audience where we're beginning. And we're going to dig into all of these in the next several minutes that we have together. But as I said, I appreciate knowing where we are from a start. All right, so let's continue on. So what I want to try to cover as best as I can in the limited time that we have is, what are we required to validate, and how and when do we do it? How do we validate our validation, and how do we defend it with the FDA? what are the consequences if we get our validation wrong? If we change, perhaps I should say when we change our medical device, this is when it's already on the market, when and how do we have to revalidate it? What other things do we need to validate beyond just the traditional, or what I would consider to be the very myopic definition of design validation? What are we not required to validate, but we should, quite frankly, do anyway? And how do we take sort of a holistic approach to validation? That is, how do we integrate this in our overall R&D process, especially when it comes to all of the qualities that people are familiar with, your design controls, your complaints, your CAPAs, and so on. And then finally, I'll wrap up with one quick example of how our validation challenges are going to be changing in the future when it comes to things like personalized medicine, 3D printing, for example, and anything else that we can possibly squeeze in that's important. And as John mentioned earlier, I'm going to try to reserve the last several minutes at the end for Q&A. So if you have questions, please note them down, or you can submit them in advance, and we'll talk about as many as we can at the end. But bottom line, as I often like to say, answers are only as good as the questions that we ask. In other words, what good is getting the right answer if we're asking the wrong question? And putting this in sort of a validation terms, validations are only as good as the tests that we perform, or alternatively, the tests that we don't perform. That's why I kind of asked the question at the end there about validations being a waste of time and money if they're not realistic, because a lot of them I see that people do, even though they are quote unquote required, they're totally unrealistic of how we practice medicine in the real world. So this webinar is my approach to validation. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by regurgitating to you from the design controls or the quality regulation what a design validation is, or talking about how it differs from verification. Quite frankly, there's a lot of information out there already, and most of it I think is not very useful for a number of reasons. Here's one of the biggest. We have all of this regulatory and quality regulation, including the design controls and validations, and yet we continue to have a number of medical devices that experience very significant problems. So my question is very simple. If we are as good at doing validations as some people think we are, then how come we're having and continue to have so many problems? I'll leave that as a rhetorical question, but certainly something to think about. This is the traditional approach to verification and validation, the waterfall approach from the design control guidance. I'm sure everybody in the audience has heard that design verification asks, did we design the device right? On the validation side, did we design the right device? Those are two fundamental questions, but what the heck do they mean? And I want to particularly point out that when it comes to validation, which is obviously the subject of this particular webinar, asking the question, did we design the right device, is not the same as asking, did we solve the right problem, or are we asking the right question? There's an adage that we use in medicine frequently. I come from a medical background. I used to teach medical school back in the day. I would say to my med students frequently, the surgery went perfectly, but the patient died anyway. I'm sure a number of you have heard this adage before. The surgery went perfectly, but the patient died anyway. Well, the medical device design equivalent of that is we designed the device perfectly. That is, we designed the right device, but the patient died anyway. The regulatory equivalent of that is we followed the regulation perfectly. We did all that FDA asked us to do, and yet the patient died anyway. Unfortunately, these kinds of problems happen more frequently than a lot of people would like to think. So just because we have this regulation in place doesn't mean that we really do as good of a job about this as we certainly as we could be, or as we should be doing. And I think everything that we're talking about here today, not just when it comes to validation, but all of what's in the design controls, is just simply what I call prudent engineering. This is stuff that we used to teach in engineering school back in the day. I'm not sure if we still do it today, but there's nothing here that should be a surprise. So more importantly to us is, what does this mean? Again, the trite answer about validation is, did we design the right device? But if we dig into that a little bit further, in the traditional quality sense of the word, what we mean is testing our device against our design requirements. In other words, You start out with your user needs, you translate them to design inputs and then outputs, and then finally at the end with the verification and validation, you test to make sure that they meet your design requirements. Any good engineer will understand, though, that the big underlining assumption there is that your design requirements are correct. In other words, you're solving the right problem. You're asking the right question. And I'm going to show you through several examples that's not always the case. Another thing just to remind you of, because I hear people ask me this question a lot, using devices as close to the final product as possible in our final V&V testing. You know, theoretically, we would be using only our final device for our final verification and especially validation testing. But that doesn't often happen in the real world. So it is possible, and I've done this with FDA many times, to use pre-design freeze devices as part of your final V&V testing. However, if you are going to do that, you have to prophylactically address all of the changes between your pre-design freeze device that you tested and your final design freeze device. And you have to show not just FDA, but more importantly, you have to show yourself that those changes, whatever they are, a change in design, change in material, change in functionality, whatever it is, that those changes are not going to impact those results. If you can do that, then it's absolutely not a problem to do final testing on a non-final device. But if you can't do that, or in some cases it's more work to do that than to simply wait to that final device is ready, then you're probably better off taking the more traditional approach, and that is doing your final testing on your final device. But I just wanted to point out that quickly, you don't have to do that. All right, so let's dig into this in more detail. What does validation really mean? Is it, for example, just about ticking boxes on a form? In my opinion, absolutely not. On a personal note, I'm very troubled at the attitude of a lot of folks in our industry as well as FDA today, in that regulatory and quality is nothing more than just simply ticking boxes on a form. And I think that's tremendously problematic in many areas, including in design validation. So before getting into validation of the product, let's talk about are we required to validate that we're solving the right problem? Simply put, there's no regulation anywhere that asks us to solve the right problem and then to validate that we're solving the right problem. Should we? I'll leave that as a rhetorical question, but let me share with you one of my many favorite examples, the Barmetal coronary stent. As most of you know, a stent is put into a artery, in this particular case, a coronary artery that has become clogged via a disease called atherosclerosis. And we're talking about just a simple bare metal coronary stent here that's usually put in with a balloon angioplasty catheter, or it could be self-expanding, either way. And here you see what it looks like in a patient. So let's do a little reverse engineering on this product. I don't mean in a biomedical engineering sense of the word. I mean in a sort of a regulatory or quality sense of the word. Well, what's the user need here? If we were to ask a typical physician or cardiologist, what would be the user need? The user need would probably be something like open up a clogged artery, an artery that has atherosclerosis. And so then any prudent engineer will take that user need and translate it into design inputs, and then you'll end up at the end of this process with something that looks like the Barmetal stent that you see on the screen. The problem is, does this influence, does this limit, does this bias our design? Remember I said earlier, answers are only as good as the questions that we ask. In other words, if we consider atherosclerosis to be simply a plumbing problem, opening up a clogged artery, then all of our solutions are going to look like plumber solutions, like a stent. But what's the real problem that we're trying to address in the engineering vernacular, the root cause? What's the biological problem? Ultimately, it's to prevent heart attacks. And unfortunately, I don't have a time to get into a lot of the pathophysiology here, but there is very, very little evidence to show that stents actually prevent heart attacks. There's an adage, if the only tool that you have is a hammer, all of your problems tend to look like what? Nails. If the only tool that you have is a hammer, all of your problems tend to look like nails. How does this apply to here? Very simple. If the only tool that we have is, say, a catheter, all of our problems, all of our solutions tend to look like stents, and we would not have other ideas like, for example, transmyocardial revascularization, where we use lasers to blast new channels into the heart to take over the function of the coronary arteries, or true angiogenesis, where we encourage the heart to grow new arteries. Because remember, this all goes back to the original user need. If the user need is simply defined to open up a clogged artery, you would never see any of these other solutions. Okay, so the question is, do stents solve the problem? Well, which problem do they solve? If you're talking about solving the problem of opening up a clogged artery, then yes, stents do a very good job, at least initially. Over the long term, that's a different story. But in the short term, opening up a clogged artery, they all do a good job at that. But is that the only problem that we're trying to solve? Remember, the biological problem here is the prevention of heart attacks. So here's a study from just a little over a year ago that looked at 500,000 patients this is just a statistic for you. 500,000 patients per year receive stents to relieve chest pain at a tremendous cost. This particular study, they looked at a couple of hundred patients where they compared stents to a sham, where they basically didn't put in a stent. In both groups, the doctor threaded a catheter through the groin or the wrist with X-ray guidance to open up the blocked artery. Once the catheter reached the blockage, the doctor inserted a stent if it was in the treatment group, or they didn't if it was in the sham group, and then they pulled the catheter out. Anyway, here's the bullet. Here's the important point. A procedure used to relieve chest pain in hundreds of thousands of patients per year is useless in many of them. Is useless in many of them. And I would argue that most, if not all of this, goes back to the original user need and design input. Remember, as I said earlier, answers are only as good as the questions that we ask. Solutions are only as good as the problems that we define. If we're defining the wrong problem, if we're solving the wrong problem, what good is getting the right solution? And this is not just true in stents or in cardiology. This is true in medical devices across the board. This is the cover from Business Week a decade ago in the area of evidence-based medicine. From heart surgery or prostate care, the medical industry knows little about which treatments really work. Treatments are based largely on rules and traditions, not scientific evidence. Once again, I would argue that much of this goes back to the beginning of the engineering process. What is the real problem that we're trying to solve? Let me show you the consequences of when we get our validations wrong. Some of you are probably familiar with the Da Vinci surgical robot. For those of you that are not, let me just share with you a news report from NBC from just a few months ago on the Da Vinci and some of the problems associated with which, as we'll discuss afterward, is a direct result of the validation, or perhaps better, a poor validation. Watch this.
There's no question that the Da Vinci surgical robot, seen here in a marketing video suturing a grave with precision and ease, can do extraordinary things. The only surgical robot of its kind. Many doctors, like heart surgeon Dr. Robert Poston, seen here using the Da Vinci, are believers.
The patients recover quicker, less blood loss, there's less complications.
That's because there's no big incision. It's laparoscopic surgery on steroids. The robot controls the instruments guided by the doctor at a console.
My ability to be precise is better, even than my own hands.
But the Da Vinci is not without problems. In the last 10 years, there were 22,000 adverse events filed in an FDA database citing a range of issues associated with the Da Vinci, from the most minor malfunctions to 274 deaths. Lori Featherstone, who lives with her daughter in Altoona, Iowa, wishes she'd asked more questions before having robotic surgery.
I'm just thinking right now, are you in pain?
Yes.
Yeah. All day, every day. Sorry.
3 years ago, her doctor told her she needed a hysterectomy.
She told me that I needed to choose whether to have a robot or a surgeon. And if she were me, she would elect to have the robot. Less downtime, less scarring.
But Lori had serious complications.
Basically, my kidneys were drowning. They found that my ureter had some type of thermal injury.
So somewhere in the course of the surgery, you were burned.
Mm-hmm.
Her doctor's post-operative report confirms that. also noting her colon was damaged. She's now facing a permanent colostomy. All this 2 years after Da Vinci's manufacturer, Intuitive Surgical, had been put on notice in a strongly worded letter from the FDA that, among other things, burning was a problem. Sadly, Lori is not alone. NBC News has spoken to more than a dozen patients, many of whom are suing, who say they were burned or otherwise injured during surgery with the Da Vinci, something we saw reported over and over again in FDA documents. The surgeon observed a flame, burn injury to small bowel, a burn injury to the liver. And while Dr. Poston has now performed 1,200 surgeries using the Da Vinci, he tells us before doing his first, he had only 2 hours of practice on the device and is extremely worried about the lack of doctor training.
If you want to fly a commercial airplane, it takes you 1,500 hours, but you can fly a robot after training, which isn't really that rigorous.
In fact, there are no national requirements regulating how much training a surgeon must have to operate using the Da Vinci. The FDA says it doesn't have jurisdiction. And while Intuitive Surgical offers a 4-level training program, it cannot require surgeons to complete it.
The root cause here is the training, the willingness to sell robots to people and promote them doing surgeries when they weren't adequately trained, the willingness of hospital credentialing committees to sign off on them and allow them to do it.
Dr. Poston hopes every surgeon will search his or her own conscience.
We should live in a world where we practice brutal transparency with our patients. So if we lived in that world, we would tell the patient, I'd like to operate on you, but I didn't have the time or money to have all the training that I really think that we ought to have had. Is that okay? Is that okay? Would you be okay with that?
The robot's manufacturer tells NBC News that they, quote, offer a comprehensive intensive training program that depends on the surgeon's capabilities, and that they also strongly recommend that surgeons continue training throughout their careers. Now, Lori Featherstone filed suit against Intuitive, but later voluntarily withdrew it. She says, ask questions.
Okay, so some of you are probably thinking, what does this have to do with validation? First of all, let me point out, I'm not trying to pick on Intuitive here. This is overall a good company, as well as some of the other companies that I'm going to be talking about in the next several minutes. But I am trying to use actual case studies here as lessons to be learned, because I would argue that the root cause of this problem, it is largely a validation problem. In this particular case, it's a usability validation problem. Here's what I mean by that. All of you know that usability testing is required now for virtually all medical devices today. As a matter of fact, there's lots of other trainings and webinars that talk about usability testing. But in my opinion, when I listen to a lot of these, I just laugh when I hear them because they're totally unrealistic of the real world. I'll share with you a quick example. I was speaking at a conference once, and coincidentally, the person speaking before me was talking about a usability study for a laparoscopic device, actually not dissimilar to the device that you just saw a moment ago, the Da Vinci, although it was not a robotic device. And this person mentioned that at the beginning of that usability study, part of the inclusion and exclusion criteria was that the physician had to read and follow the instructions for use, the IFU. And I said, because I wanted to stimulate a discussion on this, you realize now that you have totally invalidated your usability study because everybody knows that the vast majority of people don't read that stuff. And the person said, yes, Mike, you're exactly right. However, it passed muster at the FDA anyway. This is what I mean when I ask the question, even if a validation, in this particular case, a usability study is required, if it's not done realistically, is it a waste of time and money? And on a personal note, I find it to be a cop-out for the FDA to say we can't do anything about this because we don't regulate the practice of medicine, which is true. And I think it's also a cop-out for our industry to say we can't do anything about this because we can't force physicians to go through the training procedure, which is also true. There are solutions to this, but again, a lot of it comes to the seemingly simple concept of validation. I think there's a heck of a lot more more to validation than just simply ticking boxes on a form. What are the additional consequences if our validation goes wrong? Well, again, I don't have time to get into a lot of these examples in detail, but what's the best horror film that you ever saw? Perhaps it was The Bleeding Edge that aired on Netflix last summer that, suffice it to say, was a scathing report of the medical device industry. Many of the problems that were discussed in that particular documentary were a result from poorly done validations. Let me just put it that way. Simply put, I believe, not as a regulatory consultant, but more importantly as a professional biomedical engineer, the better validations that we do, the less problems that we're going to have in the future. Alternatively, the worse validations that we do, the more problems that we're going to have in the future. And a similar report just came out the end of last year called Implant Files that talked about as many as 83,000 people have died and almost 2 million people have had injuries because of problems that many times could have been prevented by better validations. Here's the number of adverse events that have been reported over the last decade. Just think how many of these adverse events could have been prevented with better validations. Now, I'm certainly not going to go so far as to say that with better validations we can make perfect devices and we won't have any adverse events. Obviously, that's not very realistic, but I do strongly believe that there is a relationship between the quality of our validations and the number of problems that we have in the future. Doing a validation, in my opinion, is not enough. You have to do a good validation. That's not such a simple thing. So is the root cause of many of these problems improper or poorly done validations? Once again, I'll leave that as a rhetorical question, but certainly something to think about. Beyond the traditional design validations, which many of you are familiar with, and this is why I also say that most people have a very myopic definition of validation because they think of design validation. What else needs to be validated? Well, for example, what if you're working on a device, if you're developing a device that's reusable, that's intended to be reused, and as a result, reprocessed? Well, welcome to the very interesting world of reprocessing. For those of you that were not familiar with the duodenoscope fiasco that happened a few years ago that led to the deaths of some people at UCLA as well as other places, watch this.
A new warning is being issued this morning over a potentially deadly superbug outbreak. It's already been linked to at least 2 deaths at UCLA's Ronald Reagan Medical Center, and there are fears now that nearly 200 others may have been exposed. NBC's Hallie Jackson has this story for us. Hallie, good morning. Savannah, the patients potentially exposed here at UCLA are being offered free home testing kits so they can see if they've been infected with this bacteria. It's incredibly resistant to antibiotics, part of what makes it so dangerous.
It's been called a nightmare bacteria by federal health officials, a superbug that can kill up to half the people who become infected with it in their bloodstream. Now, about 170 patients at UCLA are learning they may have been exposed to CRE after having endoscopies between October and January. The hospital says 7 people caught the bug from instruments called duodenoscopes that may have been contaminated, and 2 died, possibly because they were infected.
CRE normally lives in the gut. If it gets into the bloodstream, it may kill 50% of the people it infects.
Similar outbreaks have happened in Seattle, Chicago, and Pittsburgh, and the CDC says at least 1 CRE case has been reported in nearly every state.
This is unprecedented, what we're watching now in terms of patients dying, patients getting infected.
The infections are linked to a specialized procedure called ERCP, when gastroenterologists use a duodenoscope to go down the throat, into the stomach, and sometimes beyond, into the small intestine to get a closer look at a patient's digestive system. But bacteria can get trapped inside the mechanism at the tip of the endoscope. Sometimes the recommended sterilization isn't enough to decontaminate the scope before it's used again.
It may be that these instruments have been transmitting somewhat innocuous bacteria to patients, and now that those bacteria become resistant, they're killing patients.
In a statement released overnight, the FDA says about 500,000 of the potentially life-saving procedures are given every year, with just a tiny fraction reporting problems from dirty scopes. The agency adds any risk must be weighed against the consequences of not seeking necessary treatment.
So what about advice for patients? Experts say if you do have an endoscopic procedure scheduled, talk to your doctor about their sterilization procedures. UCLA, for example, is now going above and beyond what's recommended for decontamination by manufacturers and by national standards. So that's all right, Holly Jackson.
So how does this relate to validation, and how is this a validation failure? It's very simple. If your device is designed to be reused and reprocessed, then it's just as important to validate your reprocessing procedure as it is to validate any other aspect of your device, your usability, your mechanical properties, your biocompatibility, and so on and so on. It's just as important. And to me, this is common sense. This is, basic biomedical engineering. But unfortunately, it was not until after this problem occurred at UCLA and a couple of other places a couple of years ago that FDA put out a guidance in this particular area. Long story short, now a validated reprocessing procedure is required for many, if not most, reusable or reprocessable devices. I would just point you to this particular guidance. This is a list of the type of devices that are required now for validated reprocessing procedures. By the way, anybody that thinks this is a complete list is quite frankly naive. This is absolutely not an exhaustive list. My professional advice is any device that is intended to be used or labeled to be used over again, you need to have a validated reprocessing procedure. And in the interest of full disclosure, I was one of several people that were invited to come in and speak at the panel meeting at FDA a couple of years ago when this occurred. And one of the many things that I said that didn't make a lot of people happy was that anybody thinks that this problem is new or unanticipated is either naive or, quite frankly, an idiot, because we've known about these problems for decades. Unfortunately, it's not until something bad happens, and in this particular case, people die, that sometimes people, pay attention. But the bottom line is we have an obligation, never mind as a regulatory obligation, we have an obligation as medical device professionals to do what needs to be done, whether it's required to do it or not. And one last thing that I'll mention just about reprocessing validations, I find it very unfortunate that some companies, even today, that are doing reprocessing validations are doing them in-house. But the problem with that is that those are not the people that are going to actually be reprocessing the device. So what good is doing a validation, in this particular case, a reprocessing validation, if it's being done by the people in the medical device company, but it's going to be the people in the hospital that are doing the actual work? To me, that makes absolutely no sense, and yet, still to this day, people do that anyway. For those that are interested, and again, I don't have time to get into this in a lot of detail, I have put out some additional resources on this particular topic that you can look at, including a podcast on this. So for anybody that's working on reusable medical devices, I recommend taking a look at some of this. Okay, another question that people ask me frequently is how early in the product development process should we start thinking about validation? I would say that it's never too early. We should start thinking about validation from the very beginning. I know that the quality, the design controls leaves validation until the end. I think that's a huge mistake. I think that we should be doing validation throughout the entire process. And I think that starting out by validating that we're solving the right problem certainly makes a lot of sense to me, because it happens over and over again. We come out with medical devices that solve that are a good solution to the wrong problem. And it's a topic of a different discussion. How do we determine whether or not we're solving the right problem? Usually it's the marketing people that will tell the R&D engineers. I used to be an R&D engineer myself many, many years ago. We want you to design this particular device. We want it to work this particular way. And usually the marketing folks is getting that information from the users, from the physicians or clinicians or surgeons. But why would anybody assume that the user, like the surgeon, would know what the right solution is? They might know what they think they want, but whether that's the correct solution or not, that's a totally different discussion. So another limitation, I think, of the quality system and the design controls is it assumes, when we say make sure that your device meets your user needs, the underlying assumption there is that your user knows what in fact they really need. Usually they know what they think they need, but not always do they know what they really need. Something to think about. How do we validate not just what we validate, but what we don't validate? To me, validating what we don't do is just as important, if not even more important, than validating what we do. Here, what do I mean by that? One of the most common reasons why submissions to the FDA are rejected is because the company does a certain number of tests, and they submit it to the FDA, and FDA says, well, we would like you to do these one or two additional tests. And they throw it right back in the company's face. To me, that's a very amateur mistake. It's a laughable mistake. You can greatly mitigate, if not almost totally eliminate that risk by taking your device, including your validation strategy, your testing matrix, what I call it, to the FDA and presenting to them. Here are the lists of tests that we're going to do to show the safety and efficacy of our device and to establish our label claims and so on and so on. But I don't stop there. I take it further. I want to tell the FDA not just the tests that we're doing, but the tests that we're not doing and why we're not doing them. In other words, I want to take away every possible opportunity I can for FDA to disagree with me, or in this particular case, to throw my submission back in my face. You know, regrettably, we've not evolved, but devolved as an industry to treat the FDA as our elementary school teacher. In other words, here's my homework assignment, here's my submission, will you please mark it up and give it back to me? I think that's very embarrassing as an industry. I do not look at it that way, right? So I want to demonstrate to my friends at the FDA that I do know what the heck I'm doing, and that in this particular case, I'm validating not just what I'm doing, but what I'm not doing. And by the way, I see a lot of companies do tests that, to me, as a professional biomedical engineer, are totally unnecessary. And yet, because they tell me they're required, they do them anyway. I think this is a total colossal waste of time and money. You know, one of the cool things that I like about my job is I get to walk into a lot of different companies in the R&D area, in the manufacturing area, and I'll see they're doing a particular test, and I'll ask them, why are you doing this test? And they say, because FDA or somebody tells us that we have to. Okay, fair enough. But if FDA didn't say that you had to do it, would you do it? Absolutely not. It provides no useful information. On the other hand, I walk into those same companies and I see they're not doing a particular test that I, as a professional biomedical engineer, think they should be doing. And I'll ask, why are you not doing it? Because nobody requires us to do so. I find it very unfortunate, and I take absolutely no pleasure in saying this about our industry, but I find it very unfortunate that regulation has become a convenient excuse to hide behind. In other words, not just to justify what we do, but what we don't do. I want to make all of my decisions, including validation decisions, not based on the regulation, at least not initially, but on the biology and the engineering first. In other words, if it makes sense to me as a professional biomedical engineer, then we'll get the regulatory to follow. That's not a problem. But we've got to begin with the biology and the engineering first. So let's now move over to the other side. Thus far, we've been talking about validation challenges pre-market. What happens once you get your device on the market and now you want to make a change to it? As you all know, that medical devices are constantly changing, constantly evolving. So when, not if, we want to make a change to our device that is already on the market, when and how do we revalidate? Welcome to the world of change management, and this gets into the whole issue of when do you submit a special 510K or a PMA supplement versus simply doing a letter to file. That's a topic of a completely different webinar. As a matter of fact, I'll show you in a moment. I did a different webinar on that specific topic that you can refer to. But one thing I want to just remind everybody of is one of the most common causes of 483s and ultimately of warning letters that companies get is change management or the lack thereof. And let me give you a classic example of a problem in this particular case that resulted directly from validation or the lack thereof. Some of you are probably familiar with the case of the vaginal meshes from manufacturers like Boston Scientific that are now facing lawsuits from over 48,000 people. Long story short, I don't have time to get into the details of this, although 60 Minutes did a really good investigation of this a few months ago. I would encourage you to watch it. Long story short, they made a change to their material while the device was on the market without going through the proper validation. They made a change to the material, in this particular case, the material supplier, without going through the proper validation. I know that's a very simple explanation to a very, very complex problem, but I think although it might be a little bit oversimplified, I think that is a sort of a synopsis. Long story short, if they, and again, I'm not certainly trying not to single Boston Scientific out here as a special villain, but if they did a better job of doing the validation, then perhaps this problem would have never happened. This is a classic example of ticking the regulatory check boxes. In other words, ticking those boxes on the form, but not doing what makes sense from an engineering or a biology perspective. For those of you that are interested in much more detail on change management and making that decision between letter to file versus special 510K or PMA supplement, I was fortunate to do a webinar for Greenlight Guru a year or so ago, Best Practices for Medical Device Change Management. Don't let FDA as an excuse hold you back. This is available on the Greenlight website. Feel free to take a look, and if you have questions about it, you can contact me. The last example I want to share is what are some of the challenges for the future when it comes to validation. One of the most significant limitations, in my opinion, of the design controls is, and I mentioned this briefly a moment ago, the fundamental tenet that you need to meet the needs of your user. That's one of the most fundamental tenets of the design controls. You need to meet your needs, the needs of your user. In other words, the whole reason why we go through user needs to design inputs and outputs and V&V and so on is to make sure that our needs meet the user. But as I said, why would anybody assume that the user knows, in fact, what they really need? They probably know what they think they need, but not necessarily what they really need. Go back to the stent example I shared with you at the beginning of the webinar. And this starts getting into the difference between what I call evolutionary versus revolutionary product development. In the medical device world, most product development is evolutionary. That is, we take a catheter or a stent or some other kind of a device and we make it a little longer, a little shorter, a little fatter, a little thinner, and we come out with our new medical device. And I understand why that's beneficial from an engineering perspective, from a business perspective, from a regulatory perspective, even from a psychological perspective. But here's the problem with that. The horse did not evolve, let me say it again. The car did not evolve from the horse. The light bulb did not evolve from the candle. In other words, you can tweak a horse as many times as you want. You'll never end up with a car. And this is why, unfortunately, much of the regulatory, including quality regulation that we have, actually encourages evolutionary product development. At the same time, discourages revolutionary product development. I have a litany of examples I won't get into here, but certainly something to think about. So again, using the horse and car metaphor, today cars are ubiquitous, but back in the day there were no cars. So imagine you were living in a time when everybody was riding a horse, and you wanted to come out with what you think was a better horse. So as a prudent professional following the regulation, you would survey your users and you would ask your users, what would you like to see in a future product? And most of them are going to tell you, I want a stronger horse, a faster horse, a bigger horse. But how many of them are going to tell you, gee, a horse is okay, but what I really want is a car? That's what I mean here by the difference between evolutionary and revolutionary product development. It's easy to take a device like a stent and make it a little longer, a little bigger, a little smaller, and so on. But what if instead you say, gee, what I really want here is the ability to get oxygen and glucose to the myocardium and the heart that can't get those things because of the occlusion in the coronary artery. If you define your problem that way, now transmyocardial revascularization, now angiogenesis, now a litany of other possibilities open up to you. And this is, I would argue, is just as important, if not more important, as part of the validation process than any of the traditional design validation approaches that most of you are thinking about. So let me share with you one last medical device example, and then we'll wrap this up and we'll have some time for Q&A here at the end. Can we print a stent? Well, 3D print a stent, I mean. Well, first question is, what kind of a stent? Barmetal stents, yeah, we can print those, but those are boring. Stent grafts, well, we're working on ways to print those, but those are pretty boring. They've both been around for a very long time. Drug-eluting stents, those are, to me, very boring as well because they've been around for a long time. How about being able to do this? Can we print a customized bioabsorbable stent? A customized bioabsorbable stent. In other words, imagine needing a stent, and there's a litany of other examples I could use, but I'm only using the stent as an example here. Imagine needing a stent, and instead of a cardiologist taking a stent out of a package manufactured by your company that quite frankly was never manufactured for you, it was manufactured for thousands and thousands of different people. Instead, the cardiologist prints the stent. Never mind in a manufacturing facility, never mind even in the same hospital. I'm talking about in the same room as what he or she is going to implant it. And that stent is designed specifically for you, the size, the shape, the materials. We could even put drugs in there. We could even put biologics in there. And on top of everything else, we make it bioabsorbable. So, for example, once the drug goes away, the device goes away. Okay, you're thinking, how can we possibly do that? And then ultimately, how can we validate it? Well, watch this. This is just one of many technologies that I'm working on. Here, you're going to see, I'm going to skip the first few seconds. Let me just jump ahead here. So here we are literally printing a stent. You're going to see out of the bottom of this machine a stent that we're then going to be able to pick up and literally, I'm not exaggerating, literally put right into the patient. This is the quintessential example of personalized medicine. So the question is, how do we validate this? Let's think about this from a clinical trial perspective. And to me, a clinical trial is nothing more than a validation. So if you're making thousands or millions of medical devices, it makes sense to do a clinical trial of perhaps a few hundred patients to show the safety and efficacy. But if you're making one device for one patient, as you see here, or one pill, because we're doing this on the drug side of the world as well, one pill for one patient, how do we validate or how do we do a clinical trial for a single patient? Is it even possible to do a clinical trial for n equal 1, for one patient? Well, I believe there's a solution to every problem, including this one. And the solution is not to create more regulation, because we've already got tons and tons of that. The solution is to get people to think. So when I look at a clinical trial, and as John mentioned in my intro, I used to spend a lot of my time designing clinical trials for companies as well as evaluating other people's clinical trial designs for the FDA. When I look at a clinical trial as a biomedical engineer, I see nothing more than a validation. And for those of you that know something about validations, you know that there's two ways that we can do a validation. One way is to validate the product. And the way we do clinical trials today is essentially a product validation. But that will never work for personalized medicine. The other way to do a validation is to validate the process. And that's the solution to the clinical trial enigma that 3D printing and other forms of personalized medicine presents. And that is, we have to validate the process. We have to, if I can explain this as simple as I can, we have to make sure that we don't validate the device. In other words, in this particular case, we do not validate the stent. Instead, what we do is we validate the parameters such that when the physician, or in this case the cardiologist, puts those parameters into our machine, out the other end comes the device that fits those parameters. In other words, we validate the process, not the product. Because if we continue to try to validate the product in the future, we're never going to have personalized devices. You simply cannot validate in a traditional sense for a population of n equal 1. So we have to take a different approach. We have to think differently. So what is it that we're really trying to accomplish here? I shared with you the adage at the beginning that comes from medicine. The surgery went perfectly, but the patient died anyway. The regulatory spin, we followed the regulation perfectly. We did all that FDA asked us to do, and yet the patient died anyway. The engineering spin, we designed the medical device perfectly, but the patient died anyway. I hope you're seeing a recurring theme here. And finally, when it comes to the testing or the validation spin, we tested or we validated the medical device perfectly, but the patient died anyway. I've already shown you probably at least 4 or 5 real examples of where that happened, where medical devices didn't work, and in some cases caused harm or even worse, because validations were either not done properly or in some cases they weren't done at all, even though they ticked off all the regulatory requirements. Now, on the flip side, and I'm guilty of this myself, there's also a common medical adage: if you're not prepared to act on the result of a test, don't do the test. I used to, as an R&D engineer many years ago, I used to, a lot of people don't like to say this publicly, but it's true, design tests to give me the outcome that I want. And there's a litany of ways that you can do that. But some companies will choose not to do a test or to do a test in a different way because they don't want the result that they don't want, obviously. That's a discussion perhaps for a different day. But bottom line, if we simply meet the regulatory or the quality requirements, if we tick those boxes on the form, have we done our jobs? Is that enough? Again, I'll leave that as a rhetorical question, but we have lots and lots of regulation, and yet we still have, a number of problems. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we don't have medical devices on the market that help people. Clearly, we have lots and lots of devices. In fact, the vast majority of devices that we have out there help people each and every single day. And that's something that we as an industry should, of course, be proud of. But at the same time, we have a responsibility and obligation to take a look at the devices that don't work so good, even though they got onto the market, and ask ourselves why. Einstein, very smart guy, Einstein said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. If we continue to apply the same regulation over and over, if we continue to apply the same kind of thinking over and over, we're going to continue to get the same result. To me, we're fulfilling Einstein's definition of insanity, and I would prefer not to do that if at all possible. So we talked about a lot of the things having to do with validation. I want to just wrap this up with a few final thoughts. First of all, I want to share with you one of my favorite parts of FDA's website on the quality side, not on the regulatory side, but on the quality side. This is what I call the preamble to the quality system regulation. And I just want to read a couple of statements, no editorializing here, directly off their website, because this is a common question that I get from people all the time. They say that the design controls are ambiguous, or the quality or the regulatory requirements are ambiguous. And I would say, yeah, why is that a problem? So regulation, medical device regulation, must apply to so many different types of devices. The regulation does not prescribe in detail how a manufacturer must produce the specific device. Rather, the regulation provides the framework that all manufacturers must follow, requiring the manufacturers to develop and follow these procedures and fill in the details that are appropriate to a given device. One of the challenges that we face in the medical device industry, much more than in the drug or the biotech industry, is in the medical device world we have a very broad range of products. On one end, we have things like Band-Aids and wheelchairs and EKG monitors, all the way through to the other end of the spectrum, things like totally implantable artificial hearts. How do you have regulation that applies across the board to all of those products in sufficient detail that it would be actionable to somebody working on a Band-Aid or an artificial heart? It's impossible to do. So instead, we have general regulation, and then it's incumbent on us as professionals working in this industry to figure out, based on our technology, based on our particular devices, how to apply it to us. FDA goes on to say, and I could not agree with them more on this. I don't always agree with FDA, but in this case, I agree with them. Manufacturers should use good judgment, I would say good professional judgment, when developing their quality systems and applying these sections to the QMS regulations that are applicable to their specific products and operations. It's the responsibility of each manufacturer to establish these requirements for each type or family of devices that will result in devices that are safe and effective. By the way, these words are very, very easy to say. They're very, very easy to put into a PowerPoint slide, but what the heck they really mean. The responsibility for meeting these requirements and for having objective evidence of these of meeting these requirements may not be delegated, even though the actual work might be delegated. This applies to people that are farming out certain aspects of their development process, of their manufacturing process, of whatever it is. So at the end of the day, it's the manufacturer, as I like to say, whoever's name is at the top of the label, that who is ultimately responsible. And believe me, that's not who just FDA is going to go after if there's a problem. That's who the product liability attorneys are going to go after if there's a problem. And finally, the essential elements of a quality system shall embody without prescribing specific ways to establish these elements. Because the quality system regulation covers a broad spectrum of devices, production processes, and so on, it allows some leeway. I would argue a lot of leeway, and it should. In the details of the quality system elements, it's left to the manufacturer, not the FDA or anybody else. It's left to the manufacturer to determine the necessity for or extent of some quality elements and to develop and implement specific procedures tailored. This is another form of personalized medicine. I call it personalized regulation, tailored to their particular processes and their particular devices and their particular technologies and so on and so on. And the reason why I share this with you is because this is one of my favorite parts of FDA's website and one of the most overlooked parts of FDA's website, because people are constantly telling me, I read the regulation, I don't know what it means. Well, you need to figure out how to apply it in your particular situation. You need to figure out how to do the validation in your particular situation. I'm going to be very blunt. If you can't do that, and if your team of people in your company can't do that, then you have no business being in this business. That's our job as professional medical device professionals working in this particular industry. So this logic should be applied to all regulation, not just the quality regulation. So again, to wrap this up, if I were to put this even more succinctly, here's my philosophy of the design controls, which extends to validation. Design controls and validations should not be about a hard and fast set of rules. It's about an understanding of the intent of why we're doing that validation, and approaching the validation process in a logical and a systematic fashion. One of my favorite quotes from Douglas MacArthur, he said, rules are mostly meant to be broken and are too often for the lazy to hide behind. Now, please don't miss my message here. I'm not saying that don't follow the rules. I'm certainly not advocating anarchy. What I'm simply saying is this. If the rules make sense, including validation, then let's follow them. But if the rules don't make sense, and we agree that they don't make sense, and we follow them anyway, is that a problem with the system, or is that a problem with us? Every single week, or sometimes every single day, I see companies following rules and doing tests that to me as a professional biomedical engineer make absolutely no sense, and yet they do them anyway. On the other hand, I see them not doing certain things that I think they should when it comes to validations, and once again, they're not doing it because they're not required to do it. I think that's a problem. If you're going to follow the rules, and there's nothing wrong with that, then going to the FDA in advance is probably not necessary. On the other hand, if you're going to do something different than what's in the guidance or the CFR, the last thing that I would do is tell that to the FDA in your actual submission, because there's no better way to ensure that your submission is thrown right back in your face than the first time that they see that you're doing something other than what's in the guidance is in your submission. So if you're not going to do something in the guidance, you need to go, I shouldn't say you need, you're not required to, but it's my professional recommendation to go to the FDA in advance and say, here's how we're going to validate our product, here's the testing that we're going to do, here's the testing that we're not going to do. This is why the pre-sub process was created. It's optional. Some people have suggested maybe the pre-sub should be required. That's a topic of a different discussion. But you have a mechanism in place where you can do that. Bottom line, don't just follow the rules, think. At this point, I wanted to make sure that I saved as much time as I could for some Q&A. I know that I went through an awful lot of information in a very short period of time. I tried to give some very specific examples as opposed to speaking in such generalities that I see so many other people in our industry making statements of the obvious, and talking in general terms, and worse, just simply regurgitating the regulation to you. That's not my approach here, but I know that all of these topics we can dig into in much more detail. Probably every example that I included in this webinar, we can do an entire webinar on it just by itself. So at this point, I want to open up our discussion. John, if we have questions from the audience, we can certainly take them. You can either type them in via your computer or maybe even speak on the phone if you want. It's totally up to you. But for those of you that are going to be disconnecting at this point, I want to thank everybody for their attendance. I want to thank John and the other folks at Greenlight for the opportunity to have this discussion today. If there's anything I can do to help, you've got my contact information in front of you. This was not your grandmother's approach to validation. I hope that if you didn't come away with anything else, you came away with that much. Thanks, John. You take it from here.
All right, sounds good, Mike. Thank you so much. All right, so we do have a few questions, and folks, we'll take a few moments to get to as many of these as we can. Certainly, if you have a question and you haven't typed it in yet, a few minutes of opportunity to do so. First question comes from Pratima. Pratima asks, how does this fit with software as a medical device where they do not need to start from scratch for design? I think we're going to have to maybe fill in a couple of gaps here, speculate a bit, but does the question make sense, Mike?
I think so. Thank you, Fatima, for that question. Look, let me say this. I get lots and lots of questions now about SAMD, software as a medical device, and now especially in the area of artificial intelligence. And I know John and I have talked about some of these things in our podcast as well as other podcasts that I've done, so I would encourage you to listen to some of those. But look, if you understand the fundamental concepts of regulation, and I don't mean what the regulation says, I mean what I call the regulatory logic. There is absolutely no difference with a pure software device, a software as a medical device versus a mechanical device versus an in vitro diagnostic versus anything else. In other words, the same concepts of, in this particular case, validation apply. At the end of the day, if you have, let's assume for the sake of discussion, that you have a device that's already on the market, whether it's a software device or a mechanical device or an IVD, I don't care. If you make a change to the device, in this particular case, if you make a change to the software, whether it's one line of code or 100 lines of code, it doesn't make any difference to me. You have an obligation to make sure, in other words, to validate that those changes don't affect the safety, efficacy, performance of your device, and so on and so on. Right? So how you do that validation when it comes to software versus hardware is obviously going to be a little different. If you have a hardware device, let's say, for example, a catheter, you probably would do this on the benchtop using what we call torture track testing and look at pushability and trackability and torqueability and so on. When it comes to software, if it's a software that's driving a physical device, or let's take the extreme software as a medical device, you still have the obligation to show that even after you've performed those changes to the software, then you're still going to get the same result. That's the simplest way that I can describe it. John, I know you work in this area as well. Any additional suggestions or more specific suggestions that would you make?
Yeah, so I am in alignment with what you're saying, but I was thinking of there might be another twist here that maybe this is, and again, I'm speculating a bit, so if you have clarification, Pratima, please feel free to add that, but almost this question almost feels like there's software that may be used in other applications that are not considered medical device, and what do you do there? Just to echo Mike's point, I think there's still that obligation, not only from a regulatory perspective, but also from patients and users of your software, that you've done the proper due diligence and testing and including validation to make sure that that software product does what you say it's going to do and meets those needs of the end user. So let's go ahead and go to the next question. I think you probably covered this already, but at the sake of being redundant, this comes from Ruchi. Ruchi asks, what are some of the examples of design validation?
What are some of the examples of design validation? Well,
yeah, I think it's probably just, what kinds of activities would be classified as design validation, I would guess.
Well, I'm going to give perhaps an answer that the person didn't expect or might not even like. I think part of the problem is starting with that phrase of design validation. What it really comes down to is, how do you define design? And perhaps, thank you, John, for reminding me of this, because maybe I didn't do a good enough job explaining this earlier. To me, design validation is a heck of a lot more than just simply making sure that your outputs meet your inputs. In other words, if you're designing, pick a device. I don't know, for some reason today I have catheters on my mind. I'm not sure why. So if your design validation of your medical device, of your catheter, should be a lot more than just making sure that it has the mechanical properties that you need, that it has the material properties or biocompatibility that you need. Go back to the reprocessing example that I shared with you. If your device is designed to be reprocessed, do you consider that part of your design validation? Clearly, most people did not, because they didn't properly validate the reprocessing process. If they did, we wouldn't have had the problems that we talked about earlier. Go back to the example of human factors or usability. Is usability a part of your design validation? Well, once again, if your user, whether it's a physician or a patient or whoever, can't use the device in the way that it's intended to be used, I would argue that that's a design validation problem. So I don't know, John, if I'm being specific enough. On the contrary, what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to broaden the scope of the audience, because I know, and this is not necessarily meant to be a criticism, but I know many of the folks in our audience do suffer from what we like to call that tick box mentality. Make sure that your biocompatibility testing is done. Make sure that your sterility testing is done. Make sure that your packaging integrity testing is done. All of those, basic kinds of testing, what I call, prudent engineering, what I call, biomedical engineering 101. Clearly, all of those things are important. But when it comes to design validation, I think we really do need to take a broader approach to that phrase. How would you respond to that, John?
Yeah, I think sometimes we do get a little caught up in the adjective that precedes the term validation. Yeah, I get it. I understand why, because you're trying to take a literal interpretation of what is maybe expressed in regulations, and I'll give this question came earlier in your presentation, so hopefully, folks, after you've had a chance to listen to Mike's webinar today on design validation, we have a little bit of a broader context. This question,
and I'll take that one. If you don't mind, John, I'll take that one step further when it comes to validation. So for those in the audience that know me or have heard any of John and my podcasts before, you probably know that a growing amount of my business is acting as an expert witness in product liability, medical device product liability lawsuits. And one of the cool things I like about working with my attorney friends is they don't limit me to what FDA requires. They want to know from me as a professional biomedical engineer, did the company, in other words, did you all in this audience do what you should have done based on the biology and the engineering? And again, I'll just use that duodenoscope as an example because that's one of many cases I've been involved with. I've been involved in the vaginal mesh case as well. But regardless of what FDA requires, I don't care if the company has ticked off all of the FDA boxes. If a expert witness like me or somebody else can show that, hey, this particular device was designed and labeled to be reused, therefore the company had an obligation, whether FDA required it or not, who cares? The company had an obligation to make sure that the device could be reprocessed properly, and they didn't do that. Or take it a step further, they did validate the reprocessing, their reprocessing procedure, but they used the people in the company to do it, when in fact the company people were not doing it, was doing it in the hospital instead. I hope, John, that most people in our audience can see where I'm going with this. In other words, ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. Similarly with usability, right? Obviously, if you have a medical device that's intended to be used by a surgeon, or even better, a device that's intended to be used by a layperson, as many of our medical devices are by using today, if the company does usability testing that meets the FDA requirements, but it's not realistic, then once again, ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. This is, an obligation that I think that we have, and I'm not talking about, turning this into a PhD dissertation, but I am talking about doing what we should do. at least in my opinion. John, what do you think?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, folks, I mean, this is checkbox is a bad way to go about it. And what I mean by that is, if you're just doing it because you have to, you're just checking a box. And I'm a big fan, a big proponent of, if I'm, the things that I'm doing as a medical device professional are, it really should be about improving the quality of life, if you want to get down to it. And as an engineer who values his time, I want to make sure that the things that I do actually contribute and elevate the value of what it is that I'm doing, not just going through the motions. So,
and I couldn't agree more. And improving the quality of life is obviously it's a very important goal. But listen, let me be pragmatic at the same time. In the shorter term, what I would like to do is minimize, if not eliminate, the press reports that we're seeing, like the bleeding edge, like the implant files, like a litany of others, because I strongly believe that there's a direct relationship between the general concept of validation and the problems that we have downstream.
I totally agree. I think we're, as an industry, I think we are sometimes quick to complete the validation of our medical device to sort of satisfy, that checkbox or that regulatory criteria. And I'm not suggesting that you go overboard by any stretch of the imagination, but I would challenge you to make sure that your validation is applicable and appropriate and effectively demonstrates the efficacy of your product, that you've designed the correct medical device. And you might get through the quote design and development phase of your device and transition into a production and a market launch. That doesn't mean that you stop learning about your device. You may gather additional feedback and input on the use of your product. That this is a feedback loop. This is an opportunity to constantly feed that back into maybe a design change or some other iteration or a modification in some way, shape, or form. So it doesn't stop just because you've completed design transfer.
Could not agree more. And because this is a webinar, John, let's not turn it into one of our podcast discussions. So let's take some more questions from the audience.
It could be a bonus. It could be a bonus session. But anyway, we'll move on. Next question comes from Brendan. Brendan asks, if you know a process can be done in-house with standard sterilization methods, shouldn't the people in the field be able to use those same standard methods?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Brandon. Thank you. One would like to assume, but I am not willing to make such an assumption. In other words, one thing that I've learned as an engineer many years ago is I can take the same set of words that are written on a piece of paper, whether it's regulation, whether it's quality requirements, or in this particular case, whether it's an SOP for a sterilization procedure, and give it to 10 different people, and I will get 10 drastically different interpretations. The underlining that assumption that Brendan is making, and this is one of the root causes of the reprocessing disaster, is that the people that are doing it in your company following this SOP are doing it in exactly the same way as somebody else outside your company, even if they're following exactly the same SOP. So if you want to do that, Brendan, and I have no problem doing this, if you want to do that, what I would suggest is that you validate your SOP. In other words, you need to prove to me, never mind what you have written on a piece of paper. You can say, step 1, do this, step 2, do that. I don't care. At the end of the day, I need you to show me that following this SOP, the people doing this in your company and the people doing this somewhere else end up at the same result. In other words, and I don't know specifically the example that you're thinking of, Brandon, but if you give me 2 devices, one device that was processed via the SOP in your company, and the second device that was processed via the same SOP somewhere else, if you give me those 2 devices blindly, in other words, I don't know which device is which, I should not be able to tell the difference. If I cannot tell the difference, then you have just validated your SOP. You've just validated what I'm talking about here. If there is a difference, now you need to go back and ask yourself the question, well, gee, are both of these groups following the same SOP if they're getting a different result? Terrific question. And if you have more specific questions, please follow up.
Yeah, for sure. Next question comes from Cameron. Cameron asks, as a contract manufacturer, not fully understanding the intended use of the components / module of the, I assume, the product that they're manufacturing, what advice would you share to do meaningful validation? Interesting angle as well.
And what was that person's name, John?
Cameron.
Cameron. So great question, Cameron. Thank you. And I think Cameron said that he was a contract manufacturer, right?
He did, yes. Yes.
Okay. So if he's a contract manufacturer, if you have questions like that, the very first place that I would be going back to is the company that's hiring you. In other words, which company is at the top of the label. Because I think, Cameron, you have the same challenge that I do as a regulatory consultant, and that is, if I don't understand what it is that the company is doing or wants to do, I can't possibly give them my best professional advice. I don't know, Cameron, what your particular subject matter expertise is, but if you have questions about the device, how it works, or I think you said, you didn't understand the intended use or something like that, you need to go back to whoever is hiring you to do this, and you need to say, hey, we need to talk about what this device is, how it works, what it's to be used, and so on. Because without that knowledge, I don't know, John, if you're going to disagree, but without that knowledge, how can I possibly decide what kind of a validation to do, whether it's appropriate, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting thing to consider, and I think sometimes a device company who leverages a contract manufacturer, it's almost like it's not like we're. I think we could be more transparent. Is probably a better way to say it. Because that contract manufacturer needs to understand some intimate details about that device in order to make sure that what they're doing in the manufacturing perspective is in alignment with what's expected that device do. So it's a tricky topic because historically we haven't been super transparent with one another. Even though a device company may be working with a contract manufacturer, we're not always open and transparent and sharing that kind of information, unfortunately.
And I would take it one step further, John. If Cameron, I'm not suggesting that you should do this now, but maybe something to think about. As a regulatory consultant, I've run into a similar problem on occasion. It doesn't happen very often. But a company, for whatever reason, they don't provide to me all of the information. This happened with one of the larger companies that I used to work with a long time ago. And I got to the point, I basically said to them, look, I'm a professional. I want to be able to give you the best professional advice that I possibly can. Obviously, my device is going to be limited to what you've told me. If you're not telling me all of the information, then I can't give you my best advice. And it might come to a point, and believe it or not, Cameron, I've had to do this myself once or twice. It might come to a point where, and I've said this, to one or two companies over the years, you might be better off if you have, some issues of sharing this information with me for whatever reason, you might be better off finding a new regulatory consultant. Now, I'm sure, Cameron, in your company, that's probably not going to make you a popular person, but it's just, as John just alluded to, at the end of the day, you need the information to do your job properly. All of us, myself included, we can only give the best advice based on the information that we have.
All right, so Mike, we're going to do one more question. I know we're wrapping things up here, and I hand selected this question because I figured you'd get a kick out of this one. So this comes from Dave. Yeah, no, this comes from Dave. Dave states, might it be a bit unrealistic to fight FDA's request to perform a particular test when even if it doesn't produce useful information is easier to do than to fight?
It's a great question, Dave. Thank you so much for asking that. And here's my response. You're exactly right. It might be. One of the things I've learned from being married is we have to pick our battles. Certain things are worth fighting over, to use Dave's word, and other things are not. And I have given this advice many times to companies. If FDA asks us to do something that I, as a professional biomedical engineer, think that it's not necessary to do, but if it's the type of thing that we can do in a pretty short period of time for only a couple of bucks, I will often say to the company, you know what, this is not necessary for us to do. However, it might be better off just for us to do it anyway, to tick the box off the form, so to speak, to keep our political capital in reserve for a battle worth fighting over later. But on the other hand, if the FDA asks us something to do that I, as a professional biomedical engineer, don't think that we should do, and it's the type of thing that's going to take a long time and cost a lot of money to do, then I will advise the company, hey, you know what, you can do this if you want to, but my advice is to draw our line in the sand. And I had one particular situation in the area of biocompatibility. I happen to be a subject matter expert for FDA in a few different areas, one of them being biocompatibility. FDA was asking us to do a pretty sophisticated biocomp test for this particular device that, in my opinion, as a biomaterial SME, was not necessary. And if we did it, it would have taken probably about 6 months and maybe cost $100,000 or more to do. We did draw our line in the sand, and we went back to the FDA and said, you know what, we appreciate your advice. However, here are all the reasons why we're not going to do this. It's not justified, and here's what we're going to do instead. Bottom line, Dave, you do have to pick your battles. That's something that we all have to keep in mind. But the other thing that I would keep in mind is that all of our decisions should be based on the engineering and the biology first, and then bring the regulation in later on. Make sense?
It does. Yeah, absolutely. And Mike, great presentation as always. Folks, here's one thing that hopefully you picked up on this session with Mike. He's thought-provoking, and this is not your grandmother's design validation. You can hear, Mike's
no offense to grandmothers, by the way.
But as you probably picked up, you can always tune in to webinars that Mike has done, past, present, and future. You can go to Greenlight.Guru. Anything that he's done is available free on demand. And some really great topics that have been discussed there. And Mike is a really prolific contributor to our industry, and trying to move the ball forward and just think about things a little bit differently. Don't just follow blindly when you're going through this. So Mike, thank you so much as always for the time, effort, and energy that you put into this. Folks, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out directly to Mike. You can see his contact information on screen. And of course, if you're looking for ways to figure out how to address validation with respect to your medical device and in the construct of your quality management system, you know what? I know a company that can help you with that. Yeah, that's right, Greenlight Guru.